Security was on high alert. There was an unauthorized person on stage. But this wasn't your typical fan. This was a 4-year-old child, and he was clinging to Elvis's legs. Tommy Richards had seized a moment when his mother Jennifer wasn't paying attention and made a break for the stage. As 30,000 people wondered what this tiny kid was going to do, Elvis put down his microphone and bent down toward Tommy. What he did in that moment would become not just the highlight of that evening, but one of the most beautiful moments of his entire career. This is the story of how a fearless 4-year-old taught the king of rock and roll that sometimes the best performances are completely unplanned, and how Elvis's response to an unexpected visitor proved that real showmanship isn't about following a script, it's about following your heart. Tommy Richards was not your average 4-year-old. While most kids his age were content with picture books and toy trucks, Tommy was obsessed with music. His parents, Jennifer and Mark Richards, first noticed his unusual musical sensitivity when Tommy was barely 2 years old. He would stop whatever he was doing whenever music came on the radio, standing perfectly still and listening with an intensity that seemed impossible for such a young child. By age 3, Tommy could identify Elvis Presley's voice within the first few notes of any song. His parents had a collection of Elvis records, and Tommy would spend hours sitting in front of their stereo system, playing the same songs over and over again. He didn't just listen to the music, he studied it. Tommy would move his little body in time with the rhythm, attempting to mimic Elvis's distinctive hip movements and hand gestures that he'd seen in photographs and on television. Jennifer Richards later said that Tommy's fascination with Elvis went beyond normal childhood enthusiasm. He didn't just like Elvis's music, she explained. He seemed to understand it on some deeper level. When Elvis sang sad songs, Tommy would get quiet and thoughtful. When Elvis sang happy, upbeat songs, Tommy would dance around the living room with pure joy. It was like he could feel what Elvis was feeling through the music. The Richards family lived in Houston, Texas, where Mark worked as an accountant and Jennifer was a part-time teacher. They weren't wealthy, but they were comfortable enough to occasionally splurge on special experiences for Tommy and his older sister, Rebecca. When they heard that Elvis would be performing at the Houston Astrodome in February 1977, Jennifer knew they had to find a way to take Tommy to see his hero perform live. Getting tickets to an Elvis concert was never easy, but the Houston show was particularly challenging because the Astrodome was one of the largest venues Elvis had ever played. The concert was being billed as a historic event, Elvis Presley performing for what could be the largest audience of his career. Tickets were expensive and sold out quickly, but Mark Richards was determined to make his son's dream come true. Mark spent weeks calling ticket brokers, checking with friends who might have connections, and even standing in line at the box office on the slim chance that additional tickets might be released. Finally, through a co-worker who knew someone who worked at the Astrodome, Mark managed to secure 3 tickets. They weren't great seats, section 27, which was far from the stage, but they were inside the building where Elvis would be performing, and that was all that mattered to Tommy. In the weeks leading up to the concert, Tommy's excitement was palpable. He practiced Elvis songs daily, perfecting his tiny version of Elvis's movements. He insisted on wearing his hair slicked back like Elvis, and he begged his mother to buy him a white shirt that looked like Elvis's stage outfits. Jennifer found a small white button-down shirt at a children's store and added some sequins to make it sparkle like Elvis's jumpsuits. Tommy also developed what his parents called his Elvis voice, a deeper, more mature way of speaking that he used when he was pretending to be his hero. Thank you very much," Tommy would say in his little voice, trying to copy Elvis's famous catchphrase. The effect was simultaneously adorable and impressive, as Tommy seemed to genuinely capture some of Elvis's charisma and stage presence. presence, even at 4 years old. February 28, 1977, was unseasonably warm for Houston. In February, and the Astrodome was packed to capacity with 30,000 Elvis fans. The Richards family arrived early, wanting to soak in the atmosphere and help Tommy process the overwhelming experience of being in such a massive venue. Tommy was dressed in his sparkly white shirt, his hair carefully slicked back, and he carried a small Elvis poster that Jennifer had bought for him at the merchandise stand. The Astrodome was unlike any venue Elvis had performed in before. Originally built for baseball and football, it was a massive domed structure that could hold enormous crowds, but presented unique challenges for musical performances. The acoustics were difficult. The stage seemed tiny in the vast space, and the distance between the performers and much of the audience was significant. But for Tommy Richards, none of that mattered. He was in the same building as Elvis Presley, and that was magic enough. As the opening acts performed, Tommy sat quietly in his seat, saving his energy and attention for the main event. Jennifer and Mark were amazed by their son's patience and focus. Usually 4-year-olds at large events became restless and cranky, but Tommy seemed to understand that this was a special occasion that required special behavior. He applauded politely for the opening acts, but kept asking, "When is Elvis coming?" When the lights finally dimmed and the familiar opening notes of Elvis's entrance music began to play, Tommy stood up in his seat and began clapping with enthusiasm that surprised even his parents. The crowd's roar was deafening as Elvis walked onto the stage in his iconic white jumpsuit, but somehow Tommy's small voice could be heard shouting, "Elvis, Elvis," with pure joy and excitement. From their seats in section 27, Elvis looked very small on the distant stage, but Tommy was mesmerized. He watched every movement, sang along to every song he knew, and seemed completely absorbed in the performance. Jennifer and Mark were delighted to see their son so happy, and they took turns lifting Tommy up so he could get a better view over the heads of the adults in front of them. For the first hour of the concert, everything went according to plan. Elvis was in excellent form, performing hit after hit with the energy and charisma that had made him famous. The Astrodome crowd was enthusiastic and responsive, creating an electric atmosphere that made the huge venue feel intimate and connected. Tommy was having the time of his life, dancing in his seat and attempting to copy Elvis's movements on his tiny scale. But during the second hour of the show, something shifted in Tommy's behavior. Instead of being content to watch from his seat, he began asking his parents if they could get closer to the stage. "I want to see Elvis better," he kept saying. "I want to talk to Elvis." Jennifer and Mark explained that their seats were assigned and they couldn't just move closer, but Tommy's 4-year-old logic couldn't accept that explanation. In his mind, if Elvis was here and he was here, there should be a way for them to meet. Tommy Richards was a smart kid, and he'd been observing the layout of the Astrodome carefully since they'd arrived. He'd noticed that there were aisles leading down toward the stage, and he'd seen ushers and security guards moving back and forth. In his 4-year-old reasoning, if other people could walk around, why couldn't he? The idea that some areas were restricted or that he needed special permission to go places hadn't really occurred to him. During Elvis's performance of Love Me Tender, when the arena was particularly quiet and focused on the emotional ballad, Tommy made his move. Jennifer was completely absorbed in the performance, and Mark was taking pictures with their small camera. Tommy quietly slipped out of his seat and began making his way down the aisle toward the stage. He was small enough that most people didn't notice him at first, and those who did probably assumed he was with an adult who was nearby. Tommy's plan was simple: walk down to the stage, climb up, and say hello to Elvis. In his young mind, mind. This seemed perfectly reasonable. Elvis was performing for all these people, so surely he wouldn't mind if one more person, especially a little kid who loved him so much, came up to visit. Tommy had seen Elvis bring fans on stage during television specials, so he knew it was something that sometimes happened. The journey from section 127 to the stage level was longer and more complicated than Tommy had anticipated. The Astrodome was enormous, and the aisles and walkways were confusing even for adults, but Tommy was determined and surprisingly resourceful. When he got lost, he simply followed the sound of Elvis's voice, which grew louder as he got closer to the stage. When security guards or ushers looked at him questioningly, Tommy would smile and wave, and most people assumed he was just a cute kid who belonged to someone nearby. It took Tommy about 15 minutes to make his way from his family's seats to the stage area, and during that time, his parents had no idea he was gone. The concert was loud, the lights were dim in the audience area, and they were focused on the performance. It wasn't until Jennifer reached over to point out something to Tommy and found his seat empty that panic set in. "Mark," Jennifer whispered urgently. "Where's Tommy?" Mark looked around their immediate area, thinking Tommy might have just moved to get a better view, but there was no sign of their 4-year-old son. They began asking people in nearby seats if they'd seen a little boy in a white sparkly shirt, but no one had noticed Tommy leaving. The Astrodome was so large and crowded that a small child could easily disappear into the masses of people. Meanwhile, Tommy had successfully navigated his way to the stage level, where he encountered his first real obstacle. The stage itself was much higher than it had appeared from his seat. From ground level, looking up at Elvis performing, Tommy realized that climbing onto the stage was going to be more challenging than he'd anticipated. But 4-year-olds are remarkably resourceful, and Tommy began looking for a way up. He found his opportunity near the side of the stage, where there were some equipment cases and cables that formed an impromptu staircase. Tommy began climbing, using the equipment to boost himself higher and higher. The stage crew was busy with the performance and didn't immediately notice the small figure making his way up the side of their carefully organized setup. Elvis was in the middle of performing "Can't Help Falling in Love" when he noticed movement at the edge of his peripheral vision. At first he thought it might be a stage crew member adjusting equipment, but as he continued singing, he realized that someone was climbing onto his stage. This was highly unusual and potentially dangerous. Security was supposed to prevent anyone from accessing the stage during a performance. But as Elvis looked more closely, he saw something that stopped him mid-song. It wasn't a crazed fan or a security threat. It was a tiny child, barely 3 feet tall, wearing a sparkly white shirt that was clearly meant to mimic Elvis's own stage outfit. The little boy had successfully climbed onto the stage and was now standing there, looking directly at Elvis with a mixture of determination and awe. The band, noticing that Elvis had stopped singing, gradually trailed off as well. The massive Astrodome began to quiet down as 30,000 people tried to figure out what was happening on stage. Security guards were starting to move toward the stage, but Elvis held up his hand to stop them. He was intrigued by this fearless little visitor and wanted to see what would happen next. Tommy Richards, now standing on the same stage as his hero, seemed momentarily overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he'd accomplished. The lights were brighter than he'd expected. The crowd looked enormous from this perspective, and Elvis Presley was standing just a few feet away, looking directly at him. For a moment, Tommy just stood there, taking it all in. Then Elvis did something that surprised everyone, including his own band and crew. Instead of signaling for security to remove the child, instead of treating this as an interruption to be quickly resolved, Elvis walked over to Tommy. He crouched down so he could be at eye level with the 4-year-old and spoke into his microphone so the entire arena could hear. "Well, hello there, little man," Elvis said, his voice carrying that warm, southern charm that had made him beloved by millions. "What's your name?" Tommy, who had been practicing this moment in his imagination for weeks, found his voice. "Tommy Richards," he said, his small voice amplified by Elvis's microphone. "I'm 4 years old, and I love you very much." The arena erupted in a collective awe as 30,000 people melted at the sweetness of the moment. Elvis grinned at that famous crooked smile and continued the conversation. 4 years old? That's pretty young to be climbing on stage, Tommy. How did you get up here? Tommy pointed back toward the equipment cases he'd used as a ladder. "I climbed up because I wanted to meet you. My daddy got tickets, but they were really far away." Elvis looked out into the audience, trying to spot Tommy's parents. "Are your mama and daddy here tonight, Tommy?" he asked. "Are they worried about you?" Tommy nodded. "They're probably looking for me. I didn't tell them I was coming to visit you." The honesty and innocence of Tommy's confession got another laugh from the crowd and a chuckle from Elvis himself. "Well, Tommy," Elvis said, "since you went to all that trouble to come see me, how about we give your mama and daddy a good view of where you are?" Elvis stood up and took Tommy's hand, leading him to center stage where the spotlight was brightest. "Ladies and gentlemen," Elvis announced to the crowd, "I'd like you to meet my new friend, Tommy Richards. He's 4 years old, and he just climbed up on stage because he wanted to say hello." The applause that followed was thunderous. But Elvis wasn't finished. "Tommy," he said, "since you're up here, would you like to help me with a song?" Tommy's eyes went wide with excitement. "Really?" he asked. "Really," Elvis confirmed. "Do you know any of my songs?" Tommy nodded enthusiastically. "I know lots of them. I know Love Me Tender and Hound Dog and Don't Be Cruel." What happened next became one of the most spontaneous and heartwarming moments in concert history. Elvis, recognizing that he had stumbled into something special, decided to turn Tommy's unexpected visit into an impromptu duet. He called for his guitar and sat down on the edge of the stage with Tommy beside him. "How about we sing Love Me Tender together?" Elvis suggested. "Do you think you can handle that?" Tommy nodded eagerly, and Elvis began playing the gentle opening chords of the song. As Elvis started singing, Tommy joined in with his small, clear voice. The contrast between Elvis's mature, seasoned vocals and Tommy's innocent, childlike interpretation created something magical. The Astrodome, designed for sports and large events, had never heard anything quite like it. 30,000 people sat in complete silence, listening to this unlikely duet between the king of rock and roll and a 4-year-old boy who had climbed on stage to meet his hero. Tommy knew all the words, and his timing was surprisingly good for such a young child. When he forgot a line, Elvis would gently prompt him, and when Tommy sang a particularly sweet phrase, Elvis would smile and nod encouragingly. But the real magic happened when Tommy began adding his own small movements to the performance. Having watched Elvis's television appearances and studied his mannerisms, Tommy began attempting his own 4-year-old version of Elvis's stage presence. He swayed to the music, pointed to the audience, and even attempted a tiny version of Elvis's famous hip movements. The effect was so adorable and genuine that people in the audience began laughing and crying at the same time. Elvis was clearly charmed by his young duet partner. Between verses, he would make comments to the audience about Tommy's performance. "This boy's got rhythm," Elvis said at one point, "and look at those moves. I think he might be trying to take my job." The interaction felt natural and unforced, as if Elvis had been performing with 4-year-old partners his entire career. When they finished Love Me Tender, the audience erupted in the longest standing ovation Elvis had ever received. But it wasn't just for Elvis. It was for the beautiful, spontaneous moment they had all witnessed between a superstar and a brave little boy. Tommy was beaming with pride and joy, and Elvis seemed genuinely moved by the experience. But Elvis wasn't ready to let Tommy go just yet. "Tommy," he said, "I think your mama and daddy are probably worried sick about you. Should we see if we can find them?" Elvis stood up and shielded his eyes from the stage lights, looking out into the audience. "Mr. and Mrs. Richards," he called into his microphone, "if you're out there, your son is safe up here with me, and he's doing just fine, but I think it's time for him to come home." Meanwhile, in section 27, Jennifer and Mark Richards were experiencing every parent's worst nightmare. Their 4-year-old son had vanished in a venue filled with 30,000 people, and they had no idea where to look for him. They had alerted security, who were conducting a search, but the Astrodome was enormous and Tommy could be anywhere. When they heard Elvis call their name from the stage, Jennifer and Mark looked toward the performance area and couldn't believe what they saw. Their son was standing center stage with Elvis Presley, waving at the crowd and apparently having the time of his life. The relief was overwhelming, but it was mixed with amazement at what their son had accomplished. Security helped Jennifer and Mark make their way down to the stage area, where they were reunited with Tommy. The reunion was emotional and relief-filled, with Jennifer alternating between hugging Tommy tightly and gently scolding him for wandering off. "Tommy Richards," she said, "you scared us to death. You can't just leave like that without telling us." But Tommy's response was pure 4-year-old logic. "I told you I wanted to meet Elvis, and you said we couldn't get closer. So I got closer myself." The innocence and determination in Tommy's explanation made it hard for his parents to stay upset, especially when they saw how happy and proud he was of his adventure. Elvis intervened in the family discussion with characteristic charm. "Mr. and Mrs. Richards," he said, "I hope you don't mind that I borrowed Tommy for a few minutes. He's a special little boy, and I think he's got a real future in show business if he wants it." Elvis then did something that surprised everyone. He took off one of his signature scarves and tied it around Tommy's neck. "This is for you, Tommy," Elvis said, "so you'll always remember the night you climbed on stage to meet Elvis. And I want you to promise me something. Next time you want to visit someone, you ask your mama and daddy first, okay?" Tommy nodded solemnly, understanding that while his adventure had turned out well, he had worried his parents unnecessarily. Elvis then addressed the audience one more time. "Ladies and gentlemen, Tommy Richards here has reminded me of something important tonight. Sometimes the best things in life are unplanned. Sometimes a little courage and a lot of heart can create moments that we'll all remember forever." Tommy didn't let the fact that he was 4 years old, or that the stage was high, or that there was security in the way stop him from chasing his dream. That's a lesson all of us can learn from. The rest of Elvis's concert that night was energized by the spontaneous moment with Tommy. The audience was more engaged, Elvis seemed more relaxed and happy, and there was a sense that everyone had witnessed something truly special. Elvis dedicated several songs to my friend Tommy and all the brave dreamers in the audience. After the concert, Elvis's management team arranged for the Richards family to meet with Elvis backstage. Tommy got to see Elvis's dressing room, meet some of the band members, and take photos with his hero. Elvis signed several items for Tommy and spent about 30 minutes just talking with the family about Tommy's musical interests and his plans for the future. "He's got natural stage presence," Elvis told Jennifer and Mark. "Most 4-year-olds would have been terrified up there with all those lights and people, but Tommy seemed right at home. If he keeps that confidence and keeps loving music, he could really do something special." Elvis also gave the family his personal contact information and invited them to attend his next Houston concert as his guests. The story of Tommy's stage invasion quickly spread beyond that night's audience. Local news stations picked up the story, and within days, it had gone national. Tommy appeared on several television talk shows, always wearing the scarf Elvis had given him, telling the story of how he climbed on stage to meet his hero. The appearance made Tommy briefly famous, but his parents were careful to keep his life as normal as possible. Elvis himself talked about the incident in several interviews over the following months. He called it one of the most genuine and beautiful moments of his career, and he credited Tommy with reminding him why he had fallen in love with performing in the first place. "That little boy climbed up on my stage because music made him happy," Elvis said. "That's what it's all about. That's why I do what I do." Tommy Richards grew up to become a professional musician, and he always credited that night with Elvis as the moment that convinced him he wanted to spend his life in music. He learned to play guitar, formed bands throughout high school and college, and eventually became a successful songwriter and producer. He never achieved Elvis-level fame, but he built a solid career in the music industry and always spoke gratefully about the encouragement Elvis had given him as a child. In interviews throughout his career, Tommy would often talk about the lessons he learned that night in the Astrodome. "Elvis taught me that real stars aren't too important to pay attention to their fans," Tommy would say. "He could have had security remove me immediately, but instead he turned an awkward moment into something beautiful. That taught me about grace, about kindness, and about the responsibility that comes with being in the spotlight." Tommy also learned about the power of taking risks and following your dreams, even when they seem impossible. "I was 4 years old and I decided I wanted to meet Elvis Presley," Tommy would tell audiences at his own concerts. "Every adult would have told me it was impossible, but I didn't know it was impossible, so I did it anyway." Sometimes the best things in life happen when you don't know enough to be afraid. The scarf Elvis gave Tommy that night became a treasured family heirloom. Tommy wore it to his high school graduation, his wedding, and the birth of his children. When Elvis passed away in August 1977, just a few months after their meeting, Tommy was devastated, but grateful that he had seized the opportunity to meet his hero when he had the chance. Today, Tommy Richards is in his 50s and still performing music. He established a foundation that provides musical instruments and lessons to children who can't afford them, inspired by Elvis's generosity and encouragement toward a 4-year-old boy who had climbed on stage to meet him. Tommy's own children have grown up hearing the story of their father's brave adventure, and they've learned the same lesson Tommy learned that night. Sometimes you have to take a leap of faith to make your dreams come true. The story of Tommy Richards climbing on stage to meet Elvis Presley reminds us that courage doesn't depend on age, size, or circumstances. It depends on having a dream that matters enough to take risks for. Tommy's 4-year-old determination to meet his hero, combined with Elvis's gracious response to an unexpected visitor, created a moment of pure magic that touched everyone who witnessed it. Elvis Presley could have handled Tommy's stage invasion as a security breach or an unwelcome interruption. Instead, he chose to see it as an opportunity to connect with a young fan and create a memory that would last a lifetime. That choice showed Elvis's true character, not just as a performer but as a human being who understood the power of kindness and encouragement. Tommy's story also reminds us that sometimes the most important moments in life are the unplanned ones. The spontaneous duet between Elvis and Tommy wasn't on any set list, wasn't rehearsed, and wasn't part of the show, but it became the most memorable part of that concert for everyone who was there. Sometimes the best performances happen when we stop following the script and start following our hearts. If this incredible story of courage and kindness moved you, subscribe and hit that like button. Share this with someone who needs to hear about the power of chasing your dreams, no matter how impossible they seem. Have you ever taken a risk that led to something amazing? Share your story in the comments, and don't forget to ring that notification bell for more inspiring stories about the moments that show us the best of human nature.